Good afternoon, everyone. I am Neeraja Kulkarni, research analyst with the Foreign Policy and Security vertical here at CSEP. It is my pleasure to welcome you all for today's event on political ideology and narratives with special reference to the US economy. We are honored to have a distinguished panel of experts with us to discuss some of the most pressing challenges facing the world stage today. The Indian economy has undergone tremendous and recurrent changes since 2014, shaped by domestic and external events, including the COVID-19 pandemic and sporadic tensions with our neighbors, some of which saw recent escalations. The United States, too, has undergone political transformations in the past decade. A few years ago, a Democratic Party leader ousted a populist president who has now come back to power, a vice president so close to being the first Asian, African, and Black woman president, all contrasting ideologies among party lines, from climate, inclusion, to economic development, war, and aid. These narratives have led to a polarized US, a US that defines and then redefines its strategic positioning on these various issues. The new administration's policies and negotiation tactics are unprecedented, reconfiguring supply chains and transnational trade, further shaping fiscal spaces in the global south. It is a matter of grave concern that scientifically proven phenomena such as climate change are being challenged again in high-level government settings, combined with escalated economic protectionism. All that affects costs of decarbonization and development for emerging economies like India. Ideologies perhaps have always shaped political narratives, but are they now absorbed as conventional wisdom? How is truth processed? Are political views fact-checked? How does it affect the US economy? To help us unpack these challenges or narratives, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Surjit Bhalla, Chairperson of the Technical Expert Group for the first official household income survey for India and previously Executive Director of the IMF for India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. Accompanying Dr. Bhalla, we have with us Montek Singh Ahluwalia, economist and civil servant, also former Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission, Government of India. He is the recipient of the prestigious Padma Vibhushan Award, India's second highest civilian award for exceptional and distinguished service. We will first hear from Dr. Bhalla as he addresses questions on the changing course of discussion and interpretation around political views. Dr. Bhalla has served as part-time member of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first Economic Advisory Council and on several government committees, including Chairperson, High-Level Advisory Group on Trade. He has taught at the Delhi School of Economics and served as Executive Director of the Policy Group in New Delhi. Dr. Bhalla has authored several academic articles, more than 1,500 op-eds in national newspapers and magazines and books, some that explore India's favorite sport, cricket. Moderating this event will be Dr. Laveesh Bhandari, President and Senior Fellow at CSEP. While managing the mammoth task of leading CSEP, Dr. Bhandari brings expertise in sustainable livelihoods, industrial, economic, and social reforms in India, economic geography, and financial inclusion. While channeling insights from his research, Dr. Bhandari will guide the discussion, exploring how such narratives impact the government and the economy as a whole. We are grateful to our esteemed speakers for sharing their expertise and to all of you for joining us in what I'm sure will be a thought-provoking and timely discussion. And with that, I would like to invite Dr. Bhandari to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm supposed to guide the discussion, and I've already failed in that task, I'm sure. But you might wonder what I'm doing here. I really don't have much to do. Apart from in case there is an argument, I'm just supposed to keep them apart. Beyond that, I have one more task, which is to just remind everyone that that there is no narrative that I can make out. I was in the United States recently, and I had about a few meetings, and every meeting the narrative was different. So perhaps you can make some sense out of that. So thank you, Dr. Bhalla. Please go ahead.
And you wanted to say something? Or?
Oh yeah, you wanted to start off, right?
Shoot off. Thanks. So first, thank you very much again for having me. And this is, I think, the third or fourth time, so maybe there's been too much narrative pushing by me. But, you know, on narratives, over the last decade, I have published 2 books and several articles on this whole notion of narrative. And I'm very interested what Laveesh just said that there was no. And indeed, what the talk will illustrate as to how narratives have now completely replaced discourse. Okay. And so I've gathered evidence for a very, you've got the first, for three different issues. And the first and the most obvious one, which emanated from a discussion with Montek about whether the US would enter into a recession. So that's the first big narrative I'll talk about. And, anybody who's been involved in economics or politics or anything related knows about the fact that there has been a continuous discourse and discussion about the probability of a recession in the US. And I'll talk about that. Then the second part is on, and this is where in my book, Citizen Raj, as well as in my book, How We Vote, I looked at the narratives on economic policy in India. And the third event I'll talk about is about the recent Indo-Pak conflict or war, whatever, the narrative surrounding that. So that's the order and that's the issues that I will. So look, the basic point about a narrative is that it doesn't provide any serious evidence. There's a story that people want to put out. And that story is often, and when it is not substantiated by evidence, and that's what I'll show, that's what a narrative is. Okay. And there was a recent book, it came out in 2019 or so, by a Nobel Prize winner on narratives who introduced this into the discourse. Now, so first I will talk about that Trump and his policies have been a disaster. Again, it's a narrative, and as I'll show that there's precious little evidence to suggest there has been a disaster. And one point I should also emphasize, narratives arise because of political proclivities. In other words, it is your ideology. For the part of the title is ideology and narratives. I want to oppose X, and therefore I don't do it on the basis of evidence, which we used to do. I do it on the basis of my political ideology and how it fits in. So that's the first illustration, is we are Trump. Trump is coming, and we know, whether you're in India or in Timbuktu or wherever, that basically he's very unpopular. And many would say deservedly unpopular because of his views, his way he acts, etc. So therefore, rather than opposing, look, he's done this to destroy the US economy, we claim that he's destroying the US economy, and there's precious little evidence to do so. So that's what distinguishes a fact from a narrative. And the narrative is we are entering into a US recession. We are entering into a recession in the US, and as everybody knows, when US sneezes, we all catch a cough and the rest of it. And we'll see this, which is why the whole world is very concerned about the US entering into a recession. The second issue I'll talk about, with a point to it, here, yeah, is what happened in India. And, it's not a coincidence that two of the most polarizing individuals in the world, which is Trump and Modi, have caused narratives to flourish. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that's factual. That's why narratives arise, because there are people who cannot argue against them on facts, and therefore they build a narrative. So in the case I will discuss, in the case of India, back in 2014, a decade ago, and Modi hadn't even become the prime minister. This is still a candidate. And a narrative started to be, maybe the Congress party or the opposition saw that this movement or this party, how this candidate had legs, and so they wanted to undercut him before he got to be elected. So they spun a narrative that there are no jobs, and he has promised 10 million jobs. I'll discuss that in some detail. So that's the second issue. And the third issue that I will talk about, or example, is right now what has happened in May of 2025. So barely, not even a month since it happened, which is the India-Pakistan conflict. And there are articles galore in the Indian press. We know at the same time we have the delegations of all party delegation visiting the rest of the world, putting out the India case. But there have been articles in the Indian press by distinguished experts saying there was a real problem as to how India, some have argued we lost the war. Pakistan argues we lost the war. That's not what I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to talk about the argument that we've lost a narrative on the war. So that hopefully gives you a idea as to the scope of what I'm going to talk about. Now, notice the title, and that tells it. It's spin. It's not even spin, it's an attempt to do a googly. So when this happens, I mean, facts. I mean, I grew up a long time back, and along with Montek, etc. The debate before computers entered, and even after computers entered, before AI entered or whatever, it used to be on evidence. What's the evidence? Show me the evidence. That was a rallying cry. And then we argued on evidence. Is there evidence to support whatever point? And then we all attended seminars, etc. And the person gave the evidence, and then we all discussed whether that was right or not. And we all went home, and there was no spin because it was based on evidence. Now, evidence, spin is evidence. That's the critical feature. Whatever spin, and underlying this is, as I said, that there's a belief, not a belief, sorry, there's a coexistence of the spin has come about now. In the olden days, there was a spin, and you knew it won't last very long. Now you do the spin, and you get others to do the spin, and therefore it becomes the truth. And the unfortunate, or the very fortunate reality now, and this is only very recent, i.e. the last 2-3 years. It wasn't there when I first presented the jobs debate in India 5 years ago. We now have AI. And it's amazing, as all of you have found out, I know, by now, that very quickly you can be cross-checked. And you've seen on TV even fact check. Very quickly fact checks come about. And now fact checks come at an instant. All you have to do is get on a computer and get a fact check. So therefore, it makes me wonder that why is it that we still indulge in spin. So that's broadly what, and now I'll give the evidence about the spin and to show that this is problematical, but easily solvable, because now I've, as I said, I give examples as to how we've entered into debates, endless debates, but now it no longer is the case. Okay, so let's turn now to US entering a recession in 2025. And the first point that you'll notice there is that in the US, and this has been going on for quite some time, and basically it's the last 10 years, even there, like in India, and that is that if you ask Republicans what they think about the economy, when a Democrat is present, they say it's not very good. And when you ask a Democrat, what do you think about the economy? When a Republican is present, it's awful. So let's look at the numbers. January 2024, Democrats were 44% of Democrats, this is from a Pew survey, said that it was a good economy. Republicans, 13%. Now, February 2025, January 20th is when Trump got elected. And you ask, do you think the economy is going to worsen over the next year? And Democrats said, 64% said, yes, it will worsen. 73% of the Republicans said it'll improve. Now, what's going on? Both cannot be right in terms of the assessment of what's going on. Okay? You can't have this complete divergence. One person says it's blue, the other person says it's red, and we don't know. So that's the problem that we analysts, everybody has to face. Then the prediction. Now I come to the prediction made by endless economists, etc., as to that there will be a recession. And what's the basis for it? And it seems somewhat a legitimate basis, and that's what we'll use that as a yardstick to assess whether this thing has legs. And what we have is the logic was that Trump is going to introduce tariffs, and this we knew almost from day one. And tariffs are going to increase costs, and therefore will increase inflation. And tariffs will dampen economic activity. Everything is costlier, dampen economic activity around the world. And now you multiply it with several countries all going through this, the beggar thy neighbor policy, Smoot-Hawley, and everything else that we know about from literature. Of course, it would be a complete disaster. Now, at the same time, there were people saying maybe these things won't happen or won't happen to the same degree. Nobody said it won't happen, though some of you might have seen in today's paper only, yesterday, 3 judges in the US ruled that Trump's tariffs were illegal, and which has been well in the literature that only the Congress can legislate tariffs. So it's not as if it has come as a surprise, but nevertheless, people knew that every country in the world imposes tariffs, and we are living in India, and CSEP has done some very good work showing how a closed economy, high tariffs are ruining our economy. So every economy, every leader, every economy does intervention in the marketplace. So this isn't new. So I don't think the legislation or the contention of the judges it will go very far, because it has has happened, will happen, etc. And the degree, of course, we can discuss. But I wanted to point out that the two major things were, which we'll look at the evidence now, is on tariffs will raise inflation, diminish output. So we won't have recession, we'll have stagflation. Okay. Now, what are the numbers? So this is well known. So let's see what the evidence has been. We are now in May, and tomorrow, very likely, the US is going to report a very low number for the CPI, core CPI, being close to 0% month on month, or 0.1% maximum, according to the forecast, as well as the fact that the YOY on, we'll see the lowest level of inflation tomorrow, but you don't even have to wait for tomorrow's data to understand or to appreciate the fact that inflation is not rising, neither in the US nor in the rest of the world. So that argument can be thrown out of the window. Okay, why it's not rising, we should discuss. But it's not because of tariffs that inflation is rising. What about jobs and recession, GDP? So we now have literally something called now forecasts of the GDP. And the first quarter GDP in the US was a negative number, negative 0.4. And everybody appreciated the fact that the reason it came out negative was not because of slowness of activity, was because too much activity, too many imports coming in because of Trump's tariffs. What are the GDP estimates? And as you know, recession is 2 negative quarters in a row. And this quarter, 2 months have gone, is already being reported through the now forecast as somewhere around 2.5, 2.4% growth in the US. So you'll have to wait much later for 2 quarters, successive quarters, for there to be. Okay. So that much is now let's look at what the other probably, there's something called poly market, okay, which is, if you're a betting person, then you must know about this website called poly market. You can practically bet on anything under the sun, and bet, including the elections, etc. And it's a very useful site. So what does poly market say? At its peak, the poly market reached 60% on May 2nd. May 2nd rings a bell, because that's when the Trump tariffs were announced. It seems like eons ago, but it's only about 27 days. And the recession, and that proves the point as to how, about expectations and spin, etc., that the actual people betting, this is a betting market, basically were betting 60% probability. What is it today? I haven't seen today, actually, or yesterday. It was 37%. Now, what's the meaning of 37%? Well, on January 20th, the day of inauguration of Trump, it was 27%. So as you know, recessions in the US are much talked about, and the economists, people who should know better, have forecast 5 of the last 1 recessions. So therefore, don't look at 60% or even 37% as very meaningful. Now let's look at job growth, okay? And this is a big aspect about recessions, about the economy, about the strength of the economy, etc. And economists will trot out huge uncertainty ho gayi hai bhai. We don't know what's going to happen, what the price is going to be, what people are going to do. So therefore you stop hiring, right? And I remember this debate over the last 5-6 months, that you don't hire, okay? You're being cautious because you think a recession is going to come. Instead, No change. Zero change in the number of jobs being created. And the average is somewhere around both sets of data, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in household surveys, which have unemployment and all other indicators, including jobs, as well as the payroll data, which is firm level. None of them, or neither of them rather, and actually ADP, so one can say none, which is a private survey, not showing anything. So I think, the case for asserting that the US economy will enter into a recession or high inflation is not. And as you know, this has policy implications. I mean, there is, and you will see that Trump being railed against by the Democrats, including the Federal Reserve, and which appears to be partisan, but this is not the first time we'll find out that central bankers are also partisan, and they're refusing to acknowledge that inflation indeed is coming down and quite significantly. But as I said, the spin or the contention is he's not good. I oppose him. I'm a Republican. I oppose him. And therefore, whatever he is doing is wrong. And we gather all the evidence and all the newspapers, etc. Okay. So I think I'd love to answer any questions on the US economy. And if anybody can offer me some piece of evidence that suggests that the US is in danger or the US growth rate is weakening, any of the above, we can leave it for the discussion session. Second, now closer to home. And let's read what's the first thing. Candidate Modi promises 10 million jobs a year. And if ever there was the most classic example of a narrative, a political narrative, not based on facts, is this one. All of you, I see most of you are Indians, you probably were here. Roy danda bajta tha ki bhai dekho, Modi has promised 10 million jobs a year. Okay? Never mind that this has never happened in India's history, and therefore it's worthwhile asking. Did he actually go out? So what did Modi say? Modi said the following: if BJP comes to power, it will provide 1 crore jobs, which the UPA government could not do despite announcing it before the last Lok Sabha polls. It will provide 1 crore jobs, which the UPA government could not do so despite announcing before the last. Now, he didn't have a time horizon on it. He didn't say 10 million jobs a year. He said, we'll provide 10 million jobs. Okay? Now, the dominant interpretation in public and political debate was that this was a promise of 1 crore, 10 million jobs every year. So 1 crore jobs over 5 years, or 1 crore jobs every year was the dominant. All of you read, I'm sure some of you also wrote on this. I wrote on it. Okay. Now, and who interpreted? So that's 50 million. From 10 million jobs over possibly 5 years, we are now to 10 million jobs a year. And very distinguished people, I won't name them, but you all know, you can all go to the website and find out, said this was the case. He said so. And I spent a lot of time trying to, and now it's easy because now you go to the AI. But this was in 2019 or 17, 18, spent a lot of time trying to find the evidence for them. And this I wrote about in my book, Citizen Raj. Nowhere. And who interpreted thus? Economic Times and India Today. Now, both allegedly not pro-Modi, okay? But that may be a coincidence, but it is just indicative of the debate. Interestingly enough, the manifesto, every party produces a manifesto, you know, before an election, that came out. The BJP manifesto didn't mention any number for job creation except stating that job creation was a priority. So there's no evidence of 10 million jobs or whatever, and it was a reference to that they promised X and they didn't deliver. From there it is interpreting. Now let's look at the record. And this was presented over here, CSEP and other places. What is a record? The TK, whatever happened. Paid jobs. And here at CSEP, I had this whole discussion about paid versus unpaid jobs, etc. Paid jobs, since Modi came to power, are 17 million a year. 17 million. So that is people actually get income, not family workers. And female paid jobs, another big contentious debate. Women are not getting any jobs. Women are not entering the labor force, etc. You know, what passes for facts in India is quite astonishing, but I won't bore you with that. Female paid jobs, 11 million a year. 11. So the original promise was jobs, but female paid jobs are 11 million a year. Next, and the final point. Yeah, this is done. Okay. Now, it's widely asserted, the headline on this is breaking false news again. Breaking news. Pakistan won the narrative war. Okay? I won't go into who won the war, but the narrative war we can look at. And widely asserted by important elements of the Indian media that Pakistan won the narrative on the recent India-Pakistan conflict. What's the evidence? And these are foreign policy experts, you read them in the newspapers, etc., asserting that the fact that the IMF loan was given to Pakistan on the 9th of May, and the war started on the 7th of May, is proof that we lost the narrative. Because you know what? We could have convinced them that, look, blah, 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 that this is not, shouldn't happen, etc. And that what people should know and do know, that the IMF vote, certainly the one on the 9th, was, I mean, don't want to go into the details of how the IMF decides and how political it is and etc. But basically everybody knew that this wasn't, the loan wasn't going to be stopped. It's not a new loan, though they patched on a new loan as well. And that there was, I think, only one dissension, which was India, or one abstention. So there was no chance that because of the war, we started on the 7th, that we lost the narrative because we couldn't stop. Notice the logic. The war started on the 7th and we lost the narrative on the war because the loan was passed, therefore speculating that if we had won the narrative, the loan would have been stopped on the 9th. And then I won't go, okay, one other. Now, let's other. Okay. It was only after the passage of the vote and the ceasefire that IMF issued new conditionalities for Pakistan to continue receiving the loan. And it appears that these are somewhat strict conditions. There was Rajnath Singh presenting the case, whether to the IMF or to the Indian public or the Indian Parliament, etc., that India had asked for strict supervision, and the fact that now they're talking about FATF, etc., as imposing conditionalities on Pakistan is indicative that maybe, just maybe, we did not lose the narrative war. The ceasefire, won't go into that, but you read enough about it, etc. So was it Trump who engineered the ceasefire or Pakistan, which wanted the ceasefire because of various installations being hurt, including a nuclear site that was supported by the US? One last example, Indus Water Treaty. And again, all of this was happening while people were experts. And mind you, it's not people, I should say, foreign policy experts. These are people who should know better. They do know better. And the fact that they're doing this is the biggest example of spitting that I know of. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now request you, Montek, to.
Yeah, well, as always, Surjit is always fun to listen to. And actually, when he mentioned to me that, he'd like to make a presentation, it was what he said right at the beginning, that we need to focus on the whole issue of validating narratives. And that's really the way I didn't realize that you were going to bring in the Indo-Pakistan. So I'm not going to comment on all that. But I think the central issue is that what's happening at the moment is that debates are being conducted at two levels. Level one is the larger narrative. Everybody got their own narrative, and the narratives typically reflect different views, and he calls that polarization. Polarization sort of implies that you're exaggerating the differences, but there are differences. So there's a larger view. Then the trouble is that it's virtually impossible to validate the narrative, whatever it is, through an extensive documentation of whether all aspects of it are right. So typically, you have a great big narrative, and then you say, and if the following is true, the narrative is valid, then you test the following, and you say either it's true or it's not true. And I mean, the two things that happen here, which I find puzzling. One is there's no agreement to begin with. As is, what is the data that you're going to regard as definitive in proving the narrative or not proving the narrative? There's now a proliferation of data. I mean, all kinds of data are now becoming available. So typically, take the Indian economy. I mean, you get this stuff that industrial production in June has either slowed down or not slowed down. And that sort of a 1 month thing is put in order to, as it were, paint a picture. Now, what I think in his stuff, which is quite interesting, and here I have to admit that he's right, in that in the US case, I think most sensible economists, by that I mean economists I know and like, most of them said that, look, these Trump tariffs are so absurd. And by the way, they are absurd. That is bound to be reflected in poor performance. And I think he's making a very interesting point that they're not reflected in poor performance. And we need to think about that. I mean, of course, the term recession is a technical term. It doesn't mean slowing down. It means negative growth in 2 successive quarters. So technically, if he were to say, a lot of people said this will tip or push the US economy into recession. I seem to remember that quite a lot of distinguished people did say that. what is puzzling is it at least going to slow it down? Because, okay, I mean, if you don't have negative growth for 2 years and the US economy goes from 2.3% per year to 0.2% and then 0.5%, that would still not be a recession. So I'm not making a point about the technical definition of recession. But I would certainly have said that the analysis was that a shock of this kind would lead to a substantial slowing down. And of course, if there is a substantial slowing down, employment would also reflect that. Now, I'm not competent, I haven't done the hard work that Surjit has to judge whether what he's saying is correct or not. But it would certainly be true that if those projections, now mind you, IMF projections, I don't take too seriously because the IMF generally does not dare to say that the US economy is going into recession. Because if it said that, it would be forced to criticize them for whatever they're doing, which caused such a thing to happen. So let's sort of keep that in abeyance. But I mean, I would be really interested, and I would advise all of you to keep a close look, that 3 to 4 months down the road, one of two things is possible. One is that the judicial intervention that was reported yesterday, and I don't know, by the way, whether that's going to nullify the tariff increase. I mean, the judges sort of said these are not valid, but President Trump is perfectly capable of saying, well, you made your judgment, now go and enforce it, in which case the tariffs stay. Alternatively, I mean, if there are people inside the US saying, look, why don't we just blame the judge now and have fun on that and reverse the tariff decision because they're not getting us anywhere. But if the tariff decisions are not reversed and they stay, and you get the growth rates that the IMF is projecting, then I think it would be true that most of the earlier statements made by people deserve to be rethought. As far as the Indian economy is concerned, I think, except for your demonetization argument, I think the argument there has never been that the economy isn't growing at whatever it is, 6+ or so percent. The argument has been that a lot of the growth was a recovery from a very big, I mean, India had a bigger negative growth as a result of COVID than anyone else. But of course, I mean, the narrative picked up the rebound and said, that's wonderful. But even if you cancel it out, I don't think people have doubted 6.5 or so.
That's the new Hindu constant.
Huh?
That's the new Hindu constant.
The reason that's relevant, which is frequently forgotten, is the target is not 6.5. The target is somewhere between 7.8 and 8. So the question really is, if the question is, are we on track for the target, then the answer would be no. And to be fair, government hasn't, I mean, what's his name, Anant Nageshwaran, has done quite a decent job in the survey of saying it is 6.5, it's the fastest of any other country, developing country. And of course, we have to get to 8, and we'll do that in due course. So that part, I think, is not so on. Mind you, there's lots of other stuff on the Indian economy which would be quite interesting to look into in terms of short-run behavior. I mean, is export performance a problem or not? Is the slowing down of investment a problem or not? And then on that, there's this other twist. That is the slowing down of net investment the problem, or is it the gross investment? So actually, if you look through, you need to be very cautious in interpreting what you read in the newspapers, because the newspapers are understandably driven by people who are looking for a headline. So, I mean, it is not their nobody ever made a journalistic career for himself by saying, it's all quite boring and there's really no change. I mean, either you say, oh, fantastic, we have now reached some new heights. Oh my God, things are terrible. And the problem now is that there's so much data that I mean, at any given, I think a truly honest newspaper editorial would say that we are looking at all the data that's available, and out of the 12 data indicators, 6 are pointing upward, 4 are pointing downward, and 2 are flat. But you won't get that. I mean, whoever wants to plug whatever story they're plugging, they'll plug it. So I'm making a general point. I'm not responding. I'm not quarreling with Surjit on any of the things he said, except I'm admitting that I think he's right in pointing out that as far as the US is concerned, the data that he's picked out seem to suggest that the initial assessment of most of the economists that I respect, that the Trump tariffs will have a negative effect on the US economy, do not seem to be justified. Now, remember, it's not that I'm desperately interested in the US economy. It's just that the US economy is the largest economy in the world. So the fact is, if the US economy is doing fine, it's very difficult to argue that they've damaged the rest of the world. Because that the second part, which is what we're all concerned about, is actually consequential. So I mean, I don't know if he would say that, well, the US economy is doing fine, rest of the world is doing fine, nothing wrong with the tariffs. He's smiling, so maybe he's willing to agree to that interpretation. But anyway, this is just to stimulate your thinking. And I was really looking forward to hear how people would react. I would urge you to go beyond just the particular tables and to address the larger issue that he's raising, which is the link between narratives and facts. And if there are other examples that you can cite which highlight this point, I think that would be very interesting for all of us. So, thank you for asking me to kick off a discussion.
Thank you. So I'd like to just add one part to what was just said, and it's actually more of a question. So there are narratives, there are facts, and there are policies. I would say that mostly narratives don't really drive policy. You may not agree, but I would like to just like you to distinguish between when does a narrative actually end up driving policy. For instance, I think you made the point that the Fed was being biased. Yes. So perhaps that was the point, that the narrative is driving policy. But that happens rarely, right?
Well, can I add to that a little bit?
Sure.
Think of it not just as narratives and policies. Think of it also as slogans. I mean, policies are a very concrete realization of a slogan. It's possible to have a slogan which is not backed by any policies at all. Yeah. And very often it's the slogans that drive the narratives. Policies are made in a different regime altogether.
I would say that I disagree on both. Narratives, first of all, are not, there isn't any relationship, in my view, between narratives and policies, something both of you said. And that's the whole point. Narratives drive public opinion. That I've tried to document, one example after another. And it is to the credit of the policymakers, perhaps, that they see beyond this public opinion. So I think it's a political thing. It's ideology. That's in the title. It has nothing to do with actually affecting policy. And I think most people understand that they will come up with a narrative. So, for example, the 10 million jobs was meant to show X was stupid and that perhaps it will influence people not to vote for him and I will win, I meaning the opposition. That's where it is. The same thing with the Democrats, etc., to a lesser extent. I mean, I don't want to go into, and I could have gone into the big narrative for the US, which did affect the elections, was COVID. And now a lot is coming out on COVID. So I don't know if any of you interested. Robert Kennedy's, he has some crazy ideas. All smart people have crazy ideas, but there is a lot of evidence.
Just if you want to elaborate
Yeah.
some of these crazy
Okay.
ideas, so
Okay.
we
So-
haven't been following.
Okay, on COVID, I mean, remember, and I was in the US at that time, at election time, November. And COVID started in March, really, and then the lockdowns, and then the real narrative was on the lockdowns. Why this, which has never happened before, and the US did it, and the US did it because the Democrats wanted to defeat, the economy was doing well, Trump was doing well, and they knew they didn't have a God's chance to win the election. So I believe, I'm certain, they invented this whole, and one example, okay, the people died. It was, I have a whole 75-page paper if any of you interested in looking, which was written in November, before the election of November 2020 on this whole issue in Senate. So the day the election results came out, CNN being one of the prime or whatever instigators, stopped advertising deaths. Otherwise, every day at 6 p.m., headline news, so many deaths reported on COVID. Suddenly, election is over, none of that.
That's interesting. I didn't know that, by the
Yeah,
way.
and I'm going to write this. I mean, it's a whole story. It's a separate seminar, but that is where, and now, so I think it's meant to influence public opinion. It has influenced in spades the public opinion in the US, and COVID being the prime example, and policies. Now, not to go into, take this exact, about Biden, that everybody knew, okay? And there's a book out now, which is a bit strange, by a CNN guy, Jake Tapper, and somebody else. I forget what the name is, just released. And where he is saying that, how did this happen? That he was allowed to be a candidate until just 1 month before the election. And then people are obviously pointing out, you guys were the guys not questioning. So in the US, it's much more prevalent where it affects events, affects elections, and not policy. Though in the case of the Fed, and the smartest, really the smartest economists in the world work for the US Fed. There's absolutely no question. Okay, but they are also individuals. They have psychology and they have ideology. So this is, I think it's much more, I think AI is in my view, AI is the biggest savior. Otherwise, God knows where we go.
When you say AI, you mean ChatGPT, is it?
Actually, I use Grok, but for those of
Okay.
you, which is really.
But you
very-
just do a fact check, ask ChatGPT what's.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do that too.
Yeah.
It's very useful.
And,
I find Perplexity better, actually.
no,
Really good.
but we can disagree. But the point is, all
Let's
of them.
have that separate one for them.
Yeah. It's separate, but it's great. That's the big story going on in the world. Then another one is, so anyway, that answers that question. Let's just get, so it is affecting, doesn't affect policy, thankfully, but affects public opinion, and then the consequences of public opinion.
Thank you. Questions?
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. I wanted to ask you about the role of social media in limiting these narratives. One, I want to disagree with you on a level of narratives and policy. We have seen in the US a lot of, you can see gender rights. You can see how white South Africans are giving space in America now. But this is a narrative and this is an ideology of a future that they want.
Hmm.
Similar things in India with a socio-technical imaginary of a nation that is very religious. There's a nationalism that we are going towards. So we have established we are in a post-truth era, and it is affecting the economy. But who is it going to be better for? Is also the question, right? Just the economy getting better is not good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you want to answer
Yeah.
one at a time and then we can?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Or do you want us, or do you want
Maybe
me to?
take three questions at a time.
Yeah.
So another over there.
So in context of India, my question is that what do you think that in India, it's the narrative which is driving the policies, as in, or it's that the government already know what policy they are going to have, and then they spun a narrative around it? Because, sometimes I feel that it's not very easy to gauge the public opinion, and there is a possibility that government may not be agreeing to a particular policy, but they believe that public opinion is in that side, and that's why they go with that policy. So that also at times happens. Government is not always in control of what public thinks. So both things can happen. So what do you think in India, at least in last 2 decades, and especially in last one decade, what happened? That government already had an idea what policy they wanted, and then they spun a narrative around it, or sometimes narrative which was not in government control pushed for a particular policy.
Thank you. Right.
I wanted to just ask you, just based on some reading I'm doing at the moment, which is more, I think, potentially a philosophical question, and I wanted to draw the distinction, very sharp distinction between narrative and spin. The word spin connotates that you're telling a story that simply isn't true or not aligned with facts. But I guess my question is this: there are modern philosophers across various disciplines that are converging on a basic idea that, in fact, there are a fact for every conceivable phenomenon in the world, and possibly every conceivable combination of phenomenon in the world, and that the way that the human mind organizes facts into a hierarchy that allows us to act is through a narrative. So the basic proposition being that you can't escape having a narrative to move through the world to determine where you are and where you're going. You might look backwards and say that narrative was incorrect, but at a particular point or junction in history, there are simply too many facts. Like, for example, you could have chosen facts of a certain window or a longer window of time horizon, and you could probably choose historic facts in the same way to suit literally, potentially any story you wanted. So in that context, I just wanted to ask, how do you, because probably the most dangerous narrative is the narrative that you claim is not there, that you are saying, actually, this is just simple fact. There's no need to have a discussion about it because I'm not organizing a hierarchy, I'm simply stating a fact. So, I think is more dangerous.
Thank you. So let's just
No,
go through this.
Very, very good set of questions. And so I'll go down each one of them. The first, again, maybe start from your last one, which is also related to the other two. That look, what's the job of an analyst or an economist or any analyst, a political scientist or whatever, is to distill the evidence. The reason people get Nobel Prizes or whatever, they distill the evidence, whether it's unions affecting wages or whatever. So the point is, that is well known, that there are too many, but I don't think it is the case that the human mind can't process. And we have geniuses who have done, and even not so many geniuses. So I am not very skeptical about the fact that, and now, again, I think too many of us are concentrating more on whether AI will cause loss of jobs or whatever. I happen to think that it won't. But its biggest contribution is that we can now answer questions or problems in a more enlightened manner than before. Now, for example, take my talk in recession. Maybe there will be a recession. Okay. So that doesn't prove me wrong. But at each point in time, we have a responsibility as analysts, economists, sociologists, philosophers, etc., to interpret the best way. So not everybody is interested in interpreting everything or trying to weave a story. And the story is different. Every researcher, if you don't do it, then you're doing something wrong. You have to have a story when you even begin to do the research. And the story is not a narrative. It is cause and effect, this, that, and we see it in day-to-day conversations in houses and every, you know, there is a conceptualization of what's happening. And it's not, and everybody's in search of the truth. So that's fine. But what is the best available truth at that point in time? And so therefore, I think I will point out the distinction between a narrative and a story. And by story, I mean an analytical framework. It doesn't have to be equations, but some kind of framework of cause and effect. Everything in life is cause and effect. No matter what personal relationships, this, that, we think of cause and effect. And we're not often right, but it is a useful framework to have. Then I'll go in reverse order. Then the question about, you know, just before we came here, the three of us were discussing, and the caste census as to whether your point that, look, is it that you already have a policy in mind and therefore you want to collect the evidence and not? I think it's very good. I mean, it's for economists, there's a simultaneity problem and we need an identifying variable. But, but seriously, I think that it's politically, what we were discussing, in my view at least, I don't want to, it's politically motivated, this whole thing about a caste census. And it is to get elected, which is why the Congress has come up. And maybe the BJP feels they will lose something. I think, but as I said, the same, that's a separate seminar, but it's a very good point as to how do you distinguish between the two. Now, on gender rights and various, and then I would add gender imbalances and what's being done for it. I would add what's happening in Gaza and where there is, you know, I don't want to get into another political debate, but everybody knows can identify what is going on in the Gaza, for example. And yet there are narratives being spun as to how. So on gender rights, I think there is, just think of the following, and my wife is a serious researcher on gender, so I've been influenced a lot by her. And, you know, all the time, my entire career actually, as an economist or as a assembler of facts or interpreting, is always look for the delta, okay? And the delta in terms of gender imbalances being reduced is huge. Now, we're not there. And in many ways, take for example, and I think at the CSEP seminar, that female wages are now the same as men's wages, okay? But if you take the sample 15 to 64 years, then you find that the male wages are 20% or higher. Why? Apart from experience, female education has really lagged behind male education in India. So our mothers were less educated than our fathers. So you have this obvious empirical effect that you will have, if you take the sample 50 to 64, 25 to 64, you will have women earning less because it has people with less experience and people with less education, human capital. So I think at least my view is really concentrate on the delta. And if we can explain the delta, meaning the difference, and if we can explain that. And I do think on gender rights and gender imbalances, etc., the world has come a long way. It's not where it should be, but I think in many instances, it is where we should
I
be.
mean, it has regressed in the US.
Can we not have a discussion on that?
Yeah.
But I'd like to, so does
Yeah,
that,
yeah, that's basic.
okay, great.
Yeah.
Let's do one more round and then we'll take up on that particular question. Dr. Chadha?
I'm going to the mic.
No, you'll need a mic.
Yeah, so this is a query and a question on the US economy, how it is doing, and that it is 2 or 2.5% in the second quarter growth. You also mentioned about India's job creation, 10 million, whether it was for 1 year or 5 years. So when we do the trade policy analysis, so I'm not limiting myself to 2 quarters or 6 months. The impact of tariffs, good or bad, occurs sometimes with a lag. So any views that, because there would be a lagged impact of what is happening to the tariffs, which may not be clearly seen in 6 months. And so narrative and it not happening, to say something in 6 months will be a bit too much.
Any other questions? Okay, Shishir?
Dr. Bhalla, did you in your presentation also make the point that this is a narrative building is happening more now as opposed to in history or in the past?
Yeah.
And why do you say that? I mean, I don't remember any evidence, right? Because, I mean, what has changed now? It may be more visible now as opposed to not happening earlier as much. Thanks.
Okay.
Any other thing? Okay.
Yeah.
2 questions.
No, both again, let me start with the jobs in the order. And one of the points I've made earlier, and your point being that it's not short term, so it ain't over yet. Let's just see that. And, if I were being flippant, I would say in the long run, we're all dead, so who knows? But I take your point, and it's a substantive point. I don't mean to. But the interesting thing so I want to make 2 points on jobs that, again, as an analyst, you want to look at the lags. You've been a very solid econometrician, economist, etc. And it's like the identification variable. You have to really worry about lags. And I do worry about them. And I'm constantly looking in the data, whether it's for the US economy or whatever, about the possible lags. And if you just look at what's happened in the US, take the whole Trump policy on China. It started with 150 and ended up with 30. And I think, so a lot is endogenous. People's responses, policymakers' responses, game theory, negotiations, that's all happening. So the fact that you know about it, I know about it, everybody else knows about it, hence my questioning the narrative that who said, it'll end up at 150%. not, which would obviously have dire consequences. And there are various other things going on. So I want to point out that, look, it's part of analysis that, and I will say now, that I find it, and I've been following the US economy closely for now close to 30, 40 years, that you don't see it, the recession, notwithstanding the lags or even a slowing down. Matter of fact, every data I look at around the world, and I look at this on a daily basis because of my profession, which is money management for my own money. So you have to worry about all of these things. And indeed, I've been shouting from the rooftops and in some of the discussions I had in Montek that really the world is on the cusp of, I mean, not that it'll happen, but this is a major revival in the world economy, not just the US, relative to what had happened. So increase in growth rates rather than decline in growth rates. And I want to end that discussion with this whole story on jobs. That I happen to think and believe, and there's evidence, etc., that the reason AI happened was because there's an emerging scarcity of world labor. Okay, especially skilled labor, etc. So, and what, at the time, Montek and I were in graduate school and so on and so forth, the big story about development and growth was human capital. Now you've got human capital in spades with every country in the world. Now we'll talk about quality not being the same, etc. But really, the world today is not only a lot more equal than we think it is, but it's really, that's another debate. I just threw that in. But it is much more productive. And that needs to be incorporated. And as you know, fertility levels are way, way down. The world fertility average level is about 1.9. In India, there's only one state that is above the replacement level of 2.2. So I think that is one of the biggest stories. And then you have the education of the women around the world. And especially in India, we were laggards. And we can go into the political economy reasons or the bad things about the Indian economy or an Indian manager. So we can go into all that. Each one is a separate. So I just think the big story in the world is that productivity is at its highest levels and growth in productivity is at its highest levels. So therefore, some tariffs coming about, which was correct, Smoot-Hawley, when was it, 1931 or whatever, to apply that logic to today is what started me on this whole, that was a different era. And this is what I think many economists, whatever, and why the story about the narratives pushing them, they know better. Of course they know. So why? And it is political ideology.
That's it? Well, no, thanks very much. Laveesh asked me whether I wanted to say something. So I'm just kind of taking the opportunity to say the last word. I mean, I'm glad you moved into the last phase of what you said. We're typically upbeat. Things are going to be a lot better than we think. And this is really part, I mean, if you were to spell out what is the Surjit Bhalla narrative, the Surjit Bhalla narrative is things are a lot better than you think. And they're going to get better. And they're getting more equal. Thomas Piketty may not agree with you, but you're heading a government committee which for the first time is going to do household income survey So you're going to tell us what's happening. A very positive narrative. But you know, I keep hearing the other side of the narrative also. And I have this suspicion. I've been lecturing in different parts of the country. And you know, I find a combination of things amongst younger people. There's a lot of optimism. This is another point, by the way. The proliferation of data includes data on opinions. You know, and now you have to factor in, you have to ask yourself, what the hell did the Pew guys say about whatever it is that you're talking about? And you know, you get these things that on the one hand, you have the doomsayers, all your good friends, Ashoka Modi and so on, saying that India is broke, India is hopeless, etc. Then you have the Pew guys saying that the two parts of the world where India, people are most positive about the future, India and China. And, you know, see, when I lecture around, I find this as a big contradiction. And I want to think myself, how do I either reconcile it in my own mind or encourage colleagues to do research on it? One is there is a lot of enthusiasm among younger people. Now, of course, when we look back several decades to when we were younger, it's kind of natural to be positive. But you know, the picture that people typically paint about what's happening is not consistent with young people being positive. Yet I don't find young people not positive. But you know, on the other hand, if you ask young people, are things getting more unequal? Are the rich getting much richer and the poor getting poorer? They say, yeah, that's true. So the same people who are very positive have a very negative view on how their economy or their society is evolving. You need to sort of find a comprehensive narrative into which you can fit all these things.
Let me just
And this is-
respond to that.
We should
Yeah.
we should study more. Your wife is doing the right thing, studying sociology. Because if you ask me, you know, my biggest regret as an economist and someone who may not have been effective or not is another matter, was very much involved in policy. Complete ignorance of the importance of caste. And that's quite a devastating comment to make. I mean, if you count my involvement in policy from in India at least, from 1980 to 2014, that's 34 years. And except towards the end of this period, I really was, not only I wasn't, but in none of the discussions did the focus on caste come up big way. And yet, if you talk to other people, they say it's the thing that's driving everything in India. Now, you need to give this some thought.
So on the caste, maybe not this occasion, but on the young people. And this is supportive of both the world is getting much more equal, and why the young people are not as optimistic as we were when we were the same age. And the simple story is that the young people today are much richer than any generation in whichever country you go to. But the growth in incomes of the young people will be almost 1/10 of the growth in income of the others, of the older generations. This is why you are more equal, and why the young people may not be very optimistic, but they already have, I mean, you know, so young people around, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, they all considerably, radically better off than they were. And so now, with everybody being educated, that's why I'd hate to be a young person now, starting, you know, you're not going to see, you'll have a high standard of living. but you're not going to get so young college graduates. And you're already seeing real wages are not rising. Okay? And the only people
So
for
you're
whom,
saying older people's wages are rising?
no, real wages are not rising. Average,
Okay.
average.
Oh, yeah,
And-
no, that's what they say.
And what
Profit
you-
shares going up,
And
etc.
another thing about pointing to equality improving, the blue collar workers around the world, whether in England, the US, and what are called casual workers in India, their real wages are going up. But the educated, other than if you're in the government, which that's another topic, best left government jobs. But, real wages aren't going up for the aggregate. You'll point out some guy who's a leading AI coder and his real wage is whatever, or some money manager somewhere, take the aggregate. It's not. So it's much more spread out, the wealth, the growth, etc. And there's lots of Indian data to support. I mean, just to end this, the NSS survey for 23-24 as well as 22-23 showed a steep decline in inequality. So unless somebody comes up and says, and obviously, so as you said, I'm working on I'm a part of a committee to look at this. That's consumption inequality.
You're not just working, you're heading a committee
Yeah.
which is going to produce the first ever income distribution data. Up to
Yes.
now,
Yeah.
we don't have
Official.
any official.
Yeah. So we do have, and that's what Piketty has used, the 2004-5 Human Development Survey, and there's no correlation between what the Human Development Survey of NCAR had and what Piketty has. I mean, this is, ideology is, that's the nice thing now. Ideology is going to have much less of an influence in affecting opinions, in affecting, forget policy, they're not even going to affect.
But doesn't that
Because you can check
doesn't
and
that
cut.
statement contradict everything else that you said a few
No.
minutes ago? Okay. It doesn't.
No, ideology and narratives, not policy. You explicitly asked the
But
question.
policy.
It
Okay.
will not affect policy because people can see through it. We now have the tools to see through it. We saw through it before, we meaning we the people, but no contradiction.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
That's been so. Thank you once again to Montek for putting this together, and of course, Dr. Bhalla for being for being here. This was, as you said, the fourth time, and already we've charted out at least four more sessions here. So hope to see you again, and thank you everyone for being here.